Thank you so much, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to Villa Duchesne's Pavich Theater. Thank you so much for being here on this Saturday morning. It's a beautiful day. It's a full house. There are many faces I am very familiar with. There's some faces I've seen not so recently, and I'm so glad to have you back. And then there's new faces. If there's something I learned just in the last week, it's that Toni, Madame, and the entire Reavis family, they know a lot of people. And they're known by a lot of people. And it's really great to see all the different areas that you all are coming from today. Some of you were taught by Madame Reavis, whether that was at City House or here at Villa. Some of you know her through Maryville. Some of you went to school with Teresa. Some of you went to school with Toni and Mark. I mean, the list goes on and on. Many of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Rachel Gem. I'm the manager of alumni relations here. And I am going to turn it over to the man of the hour, Toni Reavis.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you to Rachel and to Don Nichols, head of school, for being such gracious hosts to allow us to come back to Villa. And of course, it's very special that we're doing this presentation here at Villa Duchesne because Mom taught here for the final 25 years of her career, after 13 at City House. And of course, all three of her children, Tressa, Mark, and I, were all Sacred Heart alums as well. Tressa at City House, Mark and I at Barra Hall, and then Tressa's daughter Maria here at Villa in '88, same class as Rachel, by the way. And so it's extra special to do it in this beautiful new Pavich Theater and the new facility here at Villa. And it's also appropriate, I think, that we're doing this on Veterans Day, November 11th, 2023. Because originally it was known as Armistice Day. And it was on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918 that the Great War, World War I, ended with an armistice signed by the Allies and Germany. And that was enacted by an act of Congress in 1938 as Armistice Day, and then amended in 1954 to make it Veterans Day for all soldiers of all U.S. wars. And how appropriate it is because these two served with such honor and such dignity. You know, like so many war stories, this is one which has persisted through the years despite this reticence to be told. So it would swirl in pools of memory. Occasionally it would be drawn to light by a visit, a card, or a call, but even though it lingered for those moments, it never fully surfaced. Because if it came fully to the surface, it might lay bare the loss, the longing, the pain that was associated with these stories. And so they remain suppressed, suspended beneath the world, and wait for another time that didn't require the silence to endure. At its very basic level, though, and so many of you know this is a story of two soldiers, one occupied by, one escaped from the forces of Hitler's Germany. Two soldiers who met and married in a matter of days without benefit of a common language. Two soldiers who were then forced to separate as quickly as they had come together, hoping solely for the hope of reunion in lives that were ever altered by the very war that brought them together. But of course, through the book, you find out that it's more than just a story of two soldiers. It tells about families, countries, cultures, pride, courage, fear, loss, and through the telling in the end, we sort of come to terms with the tectonic upheavals of war, which are still going on in the world today. Now, Tressa, Mark, and I were aware of these stories throughout our life. There were the pictures of the 16th century castle in southeastern Poland, constructed by Peter Kmita, the Grand Crown Marshal of Poland, in 1538 to 1553. There was the silver cigarette case lying on the living room table with the Polish insignia from World War I, the Polish Legion, Lieutenant August Krasicki, our grandfather. And all the signatures on the side were his officer corps from that time and that place. And then there were the medals. The two on the left, awarded to Mom for valor in the underground, in the resistance movement against Germany. The one on the right, the Silver Star for gallantry in action, awarded to Pop for his work in the Italian campaign, which is also where he was captured. But still, we were aware of the tails in their skeletal form, left inanimate. Still, it needed the sinew and pulse of detail to bring it to life. That finally started in 1983, when I didn't come home for Christmas. I moved to Boston in '74, and the first time in 1983, I was in Hawaii covering the Honolulu Marathon, and I stayed in Hawaii and I didn't come home. I sent gifts, I sent a letter, I sent, that note on the left, and then Mom wrote back to me. And this is where it really began. December 29th, 1983. My very dear one, who writes to whom, what about, why, words, whimsical thoughts, wisps of oneself, winding their way, whispering, weeping, while life whirls by. It's a shame one can't express adequately all one holds inside. Maybe one day we'll write that book we spoke about. It's titled Shadows and Silhouettes. Some events as well as people cast shadows on one's life, while others are etched in one's being, and their outline remains clear and strong forever. There are many shadows, fewer silhouettes. All my love, Happy New Year, and all the very best for your birthday, Mom. P.S. In darkness, so many things seem brighter. Stars, thoughts, and tears. It is night. So I think even though she expressed her feelings more fervently than ever in that letter, the poignancy of that postscript just touched your heart, and it was speaking in that familiar accent of reticence. And so the story slipped back into its silence. It was 2 years later then. I keep journals. There it is, number 7. By the way, I'm on number 267 now. I started doing these things in 1982. But on the right, that's the page. Mom and Pop, I called up. Hi, Pop. Just calling up to say how you guys are doing. It was February 14th, 1985. Oh, hi, BISIA Toni's on the phone. We were just talking, your mother and I. It was on this date 40 years ago that we met. And Mom comes on and said, yes, in the Artist Cafe in Lublin, Poland. Pop said, it's strange when you talk about it now, but Toni, in wartime you didn't analyze, you acted. And there it began. I said, okay, you brought this up. I didn't bring this up, you brought this up. And so now it begins. And I put there's page after page, and we spent 2 or 3 hours. Who, what, when, how, what were you wearing, what time of day, what was Artist Cafe like, what street was it on, where were you coming from, et cetera, et cetera. And over that whole time, we realized we couldn't get it all in one sitting, of course, but that began. And I had permission then from that time forward to take their story as I wanted, and they were nicely cooperative throughout. Now, 2 years later, the World Cross Country Championships were being staged in Warsaw, Poland. On the right, Johnny Gugi. He won this race in Warsaw. It was his second of 5 World Cross Country Championships, one of the greatest in history. In 1992, he was the Olympic champion at 5,000 meters in Barcelona. The guy on the left is Paul Kipkoech, both from Kenya. They were almost a dead heat. They almost finished exactly together, but Gugi just edged them out the end. Paul Kipkoech, later in 1987 in Rome, was the world champion at the track and field championships at 10,000 meters. And so that's how good that race was there. But Mom and I, on the left, I was in Warsaw in 1987. I see my tape recorder. I have all those tapes of me and Mom just interviewing. I met uncles and aunts that I had never met before, first cousins. It was very strange. I'm sure Trust had the same experience when you went. Very close blood and relations that you just never ever met, and there was this odd, very compelling, connection. So then 6 years later, we went back specifically to really research the book. And then we were in Krakow. Now, the left picture is my mom's sister, Zosia, and behind them is the palace where their mother grew up. And in the middle, that's on the square of Krakow, one of the largest in Europe, and that's the St. Mary's Basilica where our grandparents were buried. The Countess of Sechin. From there, Mom and I drove 300 kilometers from Krakow down to Lesko in the southeast corner of Poland. And that's where we went and finally saw the castle. And then we started looking at old photos, old albums, the archives in the family. And we saw Mom and her sister, 1925, there's the family together, and they lived obviously a very privileged life, living in a 16th century castle. Being her father was the count, owned all this huge estate. All the people worked for his timber industry, his fisheries industry. He owned all the farmland. It was interesting. He had what they called collateral rights, where people, when they wanted to get married, had to come ask him permission. He also nominated priests to the parishes. I mean, it was old world. I mean, it was feudal times. It really was. And so, when Mom got to the United States, of course, she was delusional. I remember one time, Frank Cusimano, Bob Brewer, and Danny Slay, my friends from Flora Place, when we first moved in to Flora Place, I'm out there in 1950, I'm out playing step ball. And those guys were playing catch across the parkway. And the whole idea was me to show that I was an athlete. Maybe they'd ask me to join the game. And the mom was upstairs correcting French tests. And she leaned down and says, "What are you doing?" And I'm saying, "I'm playing step ball, but I'm hoping to meet those guys across the street." And she says, "Well, do we know their parents?" Mom, you don't know where the bathroom light at night is. We just got here. And then her classic line, because I won't have you playing with the peasant children. I'm not certain you've seen the latest demographics of South St. Louis. I think they're interviewing for the role of banjo player in Deliverance. Oh, he walks up the way. I said, "And you don't want me to play with the Catholic kids across the street?" So, but Mom lived in that sort of world. But then you have to realize she was born in 1921. Just 3 years after Poland returned to the family of nations after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. On the left, we see how from 1795, the third partition of Poland, the country disappeared off the face of the map. And Russia and Austria and Prussia, they took all that land. So Poland didn't exist for 123 years. And at the end of World War I, with Wilson, Clemenceau, and Lloyd George being the leaders of the French and the British and the Americans, they reconstituted Poland. But one of the problems was, you see East Prussia up there near the Baltic? Well, that's a German state. So Hitler was railing against the fact that they were separated by the Polish corridor. And so it's very similar to what's happening in the Donbass region of Ukraine. Putin says, we're not invading that country, we're just going to protect the Russian-speaking people from our area who are being disabused by that government. Exactly what Hitler was saying in 1938-39 about the Czech Sudetenland and the Rhineland and Poland. Well, that was the predicate. Now, at that same time, Mom was going to her Sacred Heart Academy. Say it with me now. Zilatoska Gora. Zilatoska Gora. And she graduated in 1939, and there she is. Man, classic, huh? So that was Mom. And then after her, she got out of school in June of 1939. She went with her family to Stratton. Stratton was 235 kilometers to the east of their main estate in Lesko. It's where her brother, Stash, her second oldest brother, Stash, and his family lived. And that was the house. And Mom and her sister on horseback. And their parents were arguing, should we stay here or should we go back to Lesko? Because the noose was tightening. And Hitler was really showing signs. He had already invaded other countries. And so on September 1st, there's the family. They finally went back. That's our grandfather, August, our mother, Isabella, and then that's Zosha, and then Stash, and then that's Elka, who's the wife of, and Gusha, and then brother Xavier, then Mom, and then Yash. But the taller woman in the middle is married to the guy with the darker hair on the other side. So the husband and wives are not standing together. I don't know what that tells us, but that was the family in 1939. And then on September 1st, 1939, 60 divisions of German troops, 1.5 million soldiers invaded Poland and started the greatest cataclysm in world history. 2 weeks later, the Russians invaded on the east. You know, rock and a hard place. Poland had a cavalry-based military, 38 divisions to protect it, but strung along the entire western border with Czechoslovakia and Germany. It took a matter of weeks to be overrun by that new form of war, Blitzkrieg, the Panzer Division, supported by 1,200 Luftwaffe aircraft. And then the thing that Mom was originally with the rest of the family took off for Stratton. When the war started, you went east trying to avoid the Germans coming from the west. And when they came to another family estate, about 6-7 days on that trip, Germans were already at this estate. And the German general having dinner said, just so you know, we're leaving and the Russians are coming to take over. And they said, well, why? They said, because on August 23rd of 39, The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed between Germany and Russia, dividing Poland into spheres of influence. And Poland's all hope this during time was the fact that, well, you got the fascists in Germany, and you got the communists in Russia. One's far left, one's far right. They're bitter, bitter enemies. Well, Poland's, in that sense, the buffer state. They need us. But no, Hitler made a grand gesture. He basically put the Russian bear in hibernation while he invaded Poland and the rest of Western Europe. And then in 41, he went after the Germans as well. But for 2 years, the Russians were held at bay, and they were dealing with their own people up in Scandinavia. So that's how that was going. When they finally got back, they had to go back to Leicester. That's her grandfather, age 66, in 1939. He realized that there was no, the Germans had already come to Leicester, and the tanks were in the front drive. They took it over as their headquarters for that part of the war. There's a picture of the castle and the town of Lesko and the San River, S-A-N, the San River, and the little village of Huzela on the western side. Well, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact essentially divided Poland along these lines of demarcation. The San River was one of those lines of demarcation. Everything to the east would be taken over by the Soviets. Everything to the west would be German occupied. Well, despite how bad the Germans were, they were still Roman Catholic. They were still Holy Roman Empire. They still had nobility. So Poles and Mons spoke fluent German because they were Austrian during all that partition. So they're much more closely aligned with the Germans. You did not want to be members of the aristocracy dealing with the communists because you'd be sent right to prison camps, Siberian prison camps. So they essentially, moved. There was a friend of the family who had this, they called it a hunting lodge. That's what they call a hunting lodge. But that's where the family moved. It was about 10 kilometers on the western side of the San River. But you can see there's a road. There was no road that went right. You had to go around here and then loop around in order to get to the front of the place. And that's important for a story that's coming up. So that's where they lived. But because their father still had to run the estate, it gave reason for military-aged men to be on the property. And so they became the center of the ad hoc resistance movement. They were about 70 kilometers from the Hungarian border. So people would come through their property, they would hide them, feed them, and then Mom and other people would take them the 70 kilometers through the mountain passes so they could move, get out of Poland, loop around, and fight for the West with the British. Her brother did it, one of her oldest brothers, Stash, he did that and spent the entire war fighting for the British Army. Now, during this time as well, that's the Krasicki, that's the family and motto. Amor patria nostra lex. Love of country is our law. And because of that, they knew there was great danger doing the things in the underground and the resistance, but love of country was our law. And so they took on this risk willingly. 2 years into the war, this ad hoc resistance was turned into official. And the Polish Home Army, called the Army Krajowa, was formed by the government in exile in London. And Mom's unit, OP-23, was set up. And the man on the right was a career military officer, Captain Adam Winogrodzki. And the Polish government in exile asked our grandfather, can we nominate this man to be the general manager of your estate, because that would give him a legitimate job to be there. And actually what he really was the head of the underground in southeastern Poland. And in the basement of the hunting lodge was his bunker. Behind all the wood, for the fireplaces and for the cooking stoves, was all this wood stacked up in the cellars. Behind all that wood was his bunker, this hidden bunker inside his headquarters. Guns, ammunition, maps, radios. And one day, here's another one. This is the life under occupation. That's sister-in-law, that's mom, brother, another sister-in-law, and I don't know the far guy on the right, but just look at the body language. Just look at the body language. Those moments when you're under occupation, total fear or total boredom. The circle of friends was reduced. You couldn't trust anybody. The Ukrainians were there, they were denouncing Poles, they were more on the German side. But how does it feel? This is something Mom wrote about that. My friends, can you explain to me, how does it feel? How does it feel to be young and free? How does it feel to walk happy and gay? to the tune of one's heart, without fear, without bombs, which are burying fast one's present, future, and past. My friends, can you explain to me? Is it merely by chance that you can give the answer, while I can only ask? How does it feel to be young and happy and free? Again, that Polish melancholy, that deep feeling that she had. But she said that's how you lived. But because she was young, because she was attractive, because she spoke fluent German, they didn't take her seriously because she was just a young woman. So there was another time, at this hunting lodge. Her brother Yash and her sister Zosha were alone at home on a Sunday morning. Parents were at church. Part of what Captain Vinogradsky had was radios. Those are all confiscated. If you find these radios, you're dead. They had 3 radios in the basement. One of the duties of brother Yash was the communications in the underground. So they had one of the radios up in the foyer checking for, trying to find BBC, trying to find news that they could report. Well, you never knew when anyone was going to make a visit unannounced. But you could hear, because you had to loop around that road to get to the front of the house, you could hear an approaching car. All of a sudden they heard a crunch of tires on the snow coming. No time to really, you couldn't get the radio back down to the basement. These are big, these are not little, radios, these are big things. Yash grabbed it in his arms, ran upstairs as best he could, trying to just hide it somewhere. All of a sudden there's a knock on the door, open the door, Mom did, and then there's these 2 Gestapo officers with their weapons and a Ukrainian who was denouncing the family. Yes, this is the house. This is the house that has the radio, I've heard. So in comes the Gestapo. They find the radio, they're dead. They don't know. Yash is now coming down the stairs, straightening his sweater. They didn't know how well he could hide the thing. But the bottom line is, one guy took Yash, and they were to search the house. Mom and her sister were taken by gunpoint to the living room. And there they sat, waiting to hear if there was ever going to be some disturbance upstairs. What are you going to do? What are you going to do if you hear something? So Mom started engaging the guy. Said, we don't have a radio. This Ukrainian's just a peasant, more likely than not. And he doesn't know what he's talking about. We play records. We play the German songs. Here, she put on a German song, and the guy says, no talking. We're not talking about this. Just shut up and sit down. Finally, Yash came downstairs, sort of glanced at him like, I think we're safe here. And they came downstairs, and the Gestapo started berating the Ukrainian. If you're going to accuse these people, you better have your evidence right. And they cuffed them about, and they left. And afterwards, Yash says, we searched the whole house. I put the radio in my room. And when we're searching the house, and when we came to the door to my room, the guy said, well, what's in there? And he says, well, that's my room. He says, well, I won't disturb your room. I mean, just complete random, just luck of the draw. And they got away. So that's it. You're living under abject fear or just total boredom because you have nothing to do. You have no job other than trying to find, information. Mom would go to cafes. She would go to clubs, anywhere where she'd find soldiers, and she would talk to them, flirt a little bit. And next thing you know, they'd give her information. Now, you guys, the number one story. I mean, the story of stories in the book is Mom and the machine gun, right? She talked about that one more than anything. Her unit had captured a German machine gun, it had to be refitted and fixed. Mom was told, come to the city of Sonic, where a blacksmith has it, and we have to transport this to our unit in the forest. Well, it was wrapped in a blanket, put under hay into a horse-drawn cart. Mom was told to bring your pistol, because this was a dangerous assignment. So she had her card and her papers in her breast pocket, and she also had, that's where she had her pistol as well. Now, you never knew if there was going to be a checkpoint or not. You just had no idea. So she was going out of town, and after a little while, there you saw it, up the road, 100 meters. There's a German checkpoint with the gate down, and 3 Germans with rifles. Now, they've seen you, you've seen them. You can't turn around and run away. So, again, the question, what to do? So Mom approaches. She's young, attractive, and always had confidence around Germans. So they stop, halt, show us your papers. What do you bring out? You bring out your gun and try to shoot three of them before they get you? Mom took her papers out and gave it to them. One guy went around back, poked in the straw with his gun a little bit, and what do you have underneath here? And Mom jokingly said, well, a machine gun, what else? They started to laugh, thank God. And they didn't poke anymore. Would you like a drink? Jawohl. Put the brake on, went around, stopped him, shared a drink of schnapps, shared a cigarette, And then she said, listen, there's curfew. You'll arrest me. I've got to take my machine gun. They laughed again. I'll put the guard post off she went. For that, she won the Cross of Valor. But this is the kind of, you think you're taking any crap from 10-year-old boys in St. Louis, Missouri? We were afraid of these people. With due cause. Which brings us to the other side of the equation. ISHAM Reavis. We are blessed to have the next 2 generations of ISHAM Reavis with us. They're somewhere. Here, Aish, where are you? There's Aish. Aish and Ivy. Isham, stand up or wave your hand. He's the 7th ISHAM. Ivy. Put your hand up, Ivy, just so you know who you are. You sit there. Well, the first Edward Reavis came from Great Britain in the 1660s, I believe, and he married a woman, and they had their son married a woman named Mary Isham. And their first son, they put the 2 surnames together, ISHAM Reavis. And every generation forward, the firstborn son was named ISHAM Reavis. It's great because our ISHAM now, my brother Mark's son, when he had a daughter, named her ISHAM Victoria Reavis, the first female.
ISHAM Valentine.
And ISHAM Valentine?
Yes.
But she goes by Ivy, so it works perfectly. But she's the first woman and the 8th generation ISHAM Reavis. So that's great. And then Pop grew up in Falls City, Nebraska. His sister Mary, brother Burton, and Pop was leaning against his mom, and that's her father, Burton ISHAM Reavis. They grew up in Falls City, Nebraska. And the paterfamilias was Judge ISHAM Reavis. And this was a man who grew up in Illinois before moving to Falls City. And back in those days, before he became a politician, Abraham Lincoln was an itinerant lawyer. And he would go around and stay with families while he was doing his lawyering. And one of the families he stayed with was the Reavises. And so a young ISHAM Reavis met Abraham Lincoln as a family friend. And when he decided he wanted to be a lawyer, back then you didn't go to law school, you studied with a lawyer. He wrote a letter to Lincoln asking if he could study with him. And this is the letter that Lincoln wrote back to him. It's a kind of a family treasure. It's from Springfield, Illinois, November 5th, 1855. ISHAM Reavis, Esquire. My dear sir, I have just reached home and found your letter of the 23rd. I'm away from home too much of the time for a young man to read law with me advantageously. But if you are resolutely determined to make a lawyer of yourself, the thing is more than half done already. It is but a small matter whether you read with anyone or not. I didn't read with anybody. Get the books and read and study them until you understand them in their principal features. That is the main thing. It is no consequence to be in a large town while you are reading. I read at New Salem, which never had more than 300 people living in it. The books and your capacity for understanding them are just the same in all places. Mr. Dummer is a very clever man and an excellent lawyer, much better than I in law learning. I have no doubt he will cheerfully tell you what books to read and also loan you those books. Always bear in mind that your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other one thing. Very truly, your friend, Abraham Lincoln. Tressa has the letter that used to hang above our phone in our foyer. I have a copy of the letter, and it's just this famous letter that is part of our family legacy. This is Pop in Falls City, Nebraska, where he led an idyllic life. The judge who went on to become a Supreme Court Justice of the Arizona Territory, nominated by Grant before moving back to Falls City, died when Pop was 3. They moved to Omaha, Nebraska. His mom grew up in Illinois, but St. Louisan, and she met and married, and she wanted to live in a bigger city, so they moved to Omaha, which Pop never liked, and he thought it wasn't a big city at all. He always thought of home as Falls City. And there he is on the bottom here in the little tribe, his older sister Mary, young brother Burton, and their cousin Nellie, who Tressa knows well and is a sweetheart. Well, in 1932 in February, their father died suddenly of a heart attack. Pop was at the University of Nebraska. This is the middle of the Depression, had to pull out, and within 5 weeks of their father's death, moved to St. Louis, living at their grandmother Mary Kilgore's apartment there on Union and Delmar. It's not a lovely apartment, but it was a 1-bedroom apartment, and Pop and brother Burton shared a bed for a year and a half. back in those days. Then, in 1936, after getting odd jobs for the time as a St. Louis because he didn't know anyone, finally the pastor of the Westminster Presbyterian Church across from Mary Kilgore's apartment, who said, there's a man over at the Gatesworth Hotel on Union rather, who's looking for a young man and he's from Nebraska. I think you'd be good for the job. And Pop took to that job and loved it, loved the Gatesworth Hotel. And from 36 to 42, he worked there. In 39, he was first a clerk, then it was in sales and promotion, and then he ended up being the assistant manager of the place. And in 1941, finally, when the war started, Pop signed up. He was originally classified 3C, sole support of his mother. He quickly turned that around, wanted to be 1A because he wanted her to go. Because he told Teresa, back in 1990, Toni, this was the biggest adventure of our generation, and there's no way I'm missing out on it. I mean, that's how they looked at it. There's no way I'm missing out on it. So he signed up. And finally, in January of 43, he went to Camp Walters, Texas. That's Jimmy Riley from South St. Louis, who he befriended. That's Pop on the right in that picture. Just look at the posture again. Just look at that posture. That's the real deal. And then Pop didn't like the way the clothes fit, and Pop was always a bit of a clothes horse. He said, as an officer, you can get your uniform tailored. So Pop became an officer. And he was, went to infantry school as an officer at Fort Benning in Georgia. And in May of 43, he and Jimmy Riley were back in St. Louis as new lieutenants. And then there's like the Pop's Sunday morning in your heart. This is Pop. He wanted to go overseas. He was so good at what he did in training that they kept him on as a training officer for a year. And he kept going and putting in for overseas duty. They didn't do it. You're too good at doing what you do. And finally says, yeah, but I want to go. I want to go. And finally, in July of 1944, he left from New Jersey, shipping overseas. And this is the letter that he wrote to his mother, headed July 4th, 1944, somewhere on the Atlantic. Dearest, as the heading shows, we are finally at sea, and I sort of think now I would like to have been a sailor. The sea is beautiful. I can see how the old mariners loved it. Well, I know you don't like this. It's the only thing wrong I can find with the news of our sailing. Selfishly, it pleases me very much. It's what I've wanted for some time. It sort of gives me a feeling of solidity, like a real soldier, and a chance to say thanks to this old world for all it's done for me. I recently saw Bing Crosby's new show, Going My Way. It was splendid, a very sweet story. Bing is an accomplished actor. In its theme song is one phrase, Sunday morning in my heart. You have always had Sunday morning in your heart. All of your kids had childhoods that were the most beautiful things in the world. All because you and Pop were free to bring us up in the enchanted land of Tom Sawyer, Peter Pan, and Wynken, Blinken, and Nod. You would want me to help a little so niece Kathy and all those like her had the same chance, wouldn't you? I feel, almost know, that deep down within your heart that has Sunday morning in it, you'd want me to do my part, though it is yours that is hard. I've always known how deeply I love you and my family, and yet knowing you'd rather I don't go just gives me another chance to show you how much I really do love you. All my love, ISHAM. Just to think of the patriotism, think of the sense of cause, the whole nation. I mean, there were pockets of the United States, including St. Louis, with a big German population that didn't think we should get involved. But once we got involved, Pop was in it to the teeth. So he ended up in Naples, and then they started part of the Italian camp. General Marklar's Fifth Army. Pop was in a reserve officer corps, waiting for someone to open up. And finally, in September, there's a picture of him in August with a friend who I don't know who that is. And then finally, Hill 840 in the 91st Division, the attack September 16th. He was, let me see if I can find this. It's not right here. On September 16th, 1944, you can see the red arrow. The Futa Pass was the main objective, going north. But the Germans had like a million people dug in this very well-defended hilly territory, the Apennines. Hill 821 and 840 next to it, they had to take those because the artillery fire and mortar fire was stopping the Americans from moving forward. Pop was in charge of a platoon of 45 to 50 men, and around 4 o'clock in the morning, he took the left flank, and 3 platoons went up to take Hill 821. They fought all through the night, and when morning dawned, there might have been 20 of the soldiers left, half of them dead. When they got to the top of the hill, Pop saw that there was another machine gun in place at the top of the hill, behind a hedgerow. Pop took his gun and just opened them just as quietly as possible and saw there were 3 men. One guy manning the machine gun, one guy feeding the ammunition belt, and another guy with a rifle protecting them. Well, it had gone silent for a while because they thought they had repelled the American invasion. Most of the other soldiers had been called back, but Pop lost his radio man. So he didn't get the message to come back. So now they were too isolated. So you keep moving forward. He just trusted his training. Well, he knew that also when that machine gun ran out of that one belt, the top would flip open, which allows you to take that out and put the new belt in. For that split second, when you're changing the belts, they were vulnerable. So Pop just waited to hear that little ping. And when he heard the ping, he killed 2 of them and took the other one prisoner. But now the Germans on the downside of the hill realized that the Americans are back up there. And they spent the next 3 or 4 hours trying to knock them off the top of that hill. They had no radio bands, they couldn't call reinforcements, and it got to the point where they finally ran out of ammunition. They started throwing rocks. At one point, some guy called over, a young soldier, and said, "I've been shot in the upper leg." And Pop started went over to do what he can to bandage it. He saw it like a pencil that stuck through his upper leg. I mean, there was no blood or anything, so Pop had his bandage, and he wrapped it as best he could, but there was no place to anchor it. And so he tied it around the guy's privates. You know, but he didn't put enough slack in the thing, so the guy got up to try to go back into his foxhole. And then Pop overheard the guy say, "Whatever you do, don't let the lieutenant bandage you." And Pop says, "Here we are on the point of death, and here are young soldiers laughing." He says, "That's what they do. They're not crying. They're not worrying about their family back home." He said, "Your entire life is that 10 feet on your left and that 10 feet on your right. And where's my next meal?" Overhead, birds fluttered by on oblivious wings. The sun was shining as brightly as it ever did here in St. Louis, Missouri, on Veterans Day in 2023, but their life was in danger. Finally, when they realized that rocks were being thrown, that they weren't grenades, the Germans came up. 2 bullets bounced off, Pop hit as well as he could down in his foxhole. 2 bullets bounced off his helmet. He thought, this is it. He looked up, and there was a group of Germans, guns pointed down at him, like holding spades in the grave he'd already dug for himself. "Rouse, Rouse, get up." They took him down. They took him down to the far side of the hill where their headquarters were. And they actually set him up in a firing squad. They're going to shoot him. And Pop ripped open his shirt. He said, "I don't know why I did that. I didn't want the bullets to go through his dirty shirt." Didn't make any sense, but I guess you're not thinking straight at the time. But the German officer realized that was an officer, and they told him, "Don't shoot him, bring him over here." And Pop said, the guy offered him a drink. So they had a drink. And they said there's like 7 bodies laid out, dead soldiers. And the guy said, "You did this." And Pop said, "C'est la guerre. That's war." The guy said, "Yeah, well." They marched him off. And the next place they marched him off to was Stalag 7A in Moosburg, Germany. That's Pop's actual identification for Moosburg. And that's the prisoner of war bulletin and what they were getting for Christmas that year. They stayed there from early October till the end of Christmas, the end of the year, 1944. From there, the Germans said, "That's off-log." That's Stalag 7A. But those for enlisted men. The off-logs were for officers that wanted to break the chain of command. So they put the officers in one camp, and they put the enlisted men in Stalags. Well, after 3 months of them being in a Stalag, they wanted to get rid of them. So they put them on a train and took them 900 kilometers up to Schubin, Poland, to off-log 64, which had been a boys' school before the war. And there were 1,500 American officers in that camp. And that's where Pop spent only 3 weeks. And on the day of January 20th, 1945, Colonel Paul Good, the commanding officer for off-log 64 of the Americans, the top-ranking American, came into the barracks and said, "Pack whatever you want to carry, whatever you can. We're moving out tomorrow. We're evacuating the camp." Because they could hear the Russian guns in the distance. The Red Army was now moving west, driving Germany toward ultimate defeat. And the Germans were trying to evacuate, as it turns out, 300,000 prisoners to take them to Germany to be held really as like hostages so they could like bargain, negotiate using them as pawns. Well, on the morning of the 21st at 10 a.m., 1,471 American officers, 15 below zero, snow, I mean, brutal cold. Pop had a little, like a knit cap, gloves with holes in them, and a light jacket. That's all you had. And off they marched, 1,471 men, heading 640 kilometers into Himmelberg, Germany, to another Stalag. Well, people were dying left and right during this trek. One day, Pop ended up with this. He met this guy, Billy Ferrens, an iron worker from Pennsylvania, and they sort of hooked up. And one day, another day where they walked maybe 6-7 miles, bitter cold. Again, people were dying left and right. Next thing you know, Billy's circling this patch looking for a place to lay down. There was nothing indoors. And Pop said, Billy, you don't lay down. You lay down, you'll never get up, you'll die. So that night, he said, I'll hold you, and you sleep on my shoulder. I'll hold you as long as I can. And when I can't hold you anymore, you'll hold me. And they spent that night together like, high school kids at the prom. Except it was like the ragged beat of the heart was the only beat they had, and the coughs that were coming from the other man who were doing the same thing. Well, they didn't sleep that night, but they didn't die either. And the next morning, Pop said, Billy, that's it. We're just going to die anyway. I'm leaving. I'm going to leave. Tomorrow I'm going. Fortunately, the next day they ended up at a barn. Three doors, 3 rooms in this barn. Pop said, the German soldiers, I mean, they're tired. They don't need food. So they have to pay attention to us. So the bottom line is, I'm staying, and there's some lumber over in the corner. And Billy said, I'm with you. So they put the lumber over the top, try to hide as best they can. Germans marched everyone outside. They didn't count heads. But you don't leave that facility for the enemy. So after everyone had they heard them march away, they heard the unmistakable sound of boots returning. There's a few. Then they heard the sound of 2 grenades being activated. And into the first room, the Germans threw 2 grenades, blew the room up, sprayed it with machine gun fire. Went to the second room, did the same thing. Pop and Billy are laying down, face down on the floor in the third room. And they just held hands, knowing this is it. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited. And they thought the Germans were just messing with them, just having fun at their expense. And they waited for an hour. The Germans never blew up the third room. Again, the second or third time that Pop was on the doorstep of death and didn't die. And they got up, they went outside, and all they saw was the smudged boot trail off in the distance. And they were free, whatever that meant. And then they spent the next several days going back towards Schuben, retracing their steps, looking to go east. Couldn't go west, that's Germany. Had to go east, trying to find Russians, because those were the Allies. And so they ran into the Russians, and read the book. The Russians are crazy, and the stories are just insane, how crazy the Russians are. But finally, they made it into Lublin, Poland. And when they made it into Lublin, Poland, Pop was staying in a little farmhouse out of town. And the farmer, Mr. Szymanski, and his wife said, we're going to this little cafe in town. And that's on the corner of Piakov Street, and it's where the red signs are. That was the Artist Cafe. The group of radio artists, theater artists, there was no work, so they opened up a cafe and ran a cafe to make money. Well, Pop was in there. Mom was, at this time, studying tank warfare training because in November of '44, her unit in the Polish underground had been disbanded by the advancing Red Army. And they were told they could either go to camps in Soviet Russia, or they could join this new Berlin division, which is a Russian-controlled but Polish-led new division. And Mom was going to be in tank warfare training, and then have to go down south near Krakow, where the front lines were still raging. So Mom was trying to hitchhike out of town. It was February 14th, 1945. She was outside hitchhiking, bitter cold, too much snow, no traffic coming, no chance to get a ride. She realized this was futile, bundled herself back up, and went back into town, where she thought her sister-in-law, the husband of her brother Stash, because she was in Lublin, and she frequented the Artist Cafe. She happened to be at a communal table with Pop and Billy Ferrens and some other people. And she walked in. Pop was 33 years old. He wasn't a kid. And he said, the minute she walked in, that's the one for me. Mom joined the table. Her sister-in-law, Gusha, she said, who are these men in these odd-looking uniforms? They said, they're escaped American prisoners. We're trying to help them as best we can. But 10 minutes in, Billy Ferrens, who Pop escaped with, came from a Czech background, spoke a little Czech. So you could make a Czech word here, French word there, German word there, et cetera, et cetera. Pop nudged Billy, said, Billy, ask that one if she's married. Asked, no, she's not. Asked her if she's engaged. No, she's not. Asked her if she's going steady. They said, what's that? They didn't have that social convention, thought it was very odd, going steady. But then they said, well, they want to know why you're asking all these questions. And Pop leaned back and said, tell her because I'm going to marry her. Mom sort of toasted him like a joke, right? It's a joke. 10 days later, it went a joke. So every day they came together, not more for a couple hours during the day, and Pop just kept insisting they get married. And Mom, this is what Mom said. I found him interesting, absolutely, and someone like me in his attitude, taking charge, free, undeterred by the thoughts of others. Here was someone who had seen and done and been where I had been. We came from different circumstances, yes, but he'd seen the same faces of deceit and evil. You met so many people in such a short time through these years, and nothing ever came of anything. But here was someone on whom I could possibly lean without fear. He says, I think you live day to day. In my mind, there was curiosity. I was not a conformist. I felt maybe there was no hope left here, though I really didn't want to leave Poland. And here's the thing. Pop had a chance to leave after 8 days, and he didn't go. And he showed up at Mom's hotel room one day, and Mom and Billy said, well, I thought, what are you still doing here? Pop said, you don't understand. I'm not leaving until we're married. And that's when Mom said, perhaps I should take this offer seriously. This was the 8th day after our meeting. We had never kissed one another, but we needed some legality. There was no time to post bans, and neither of us had any identification or documentation beyond our military identification. There was an old bishop, a bishop who was in that movement, and who knew Mom came from a prominent family. Mom went to ask him for permission. He said, no, I'm not giving you permission. Your parents would never allow this. You don't know this, you know this person 10 days? There's no way. But is he here? Mom said, yes, he's outside. Well, bring him in. Pop came in there, stated his case, said he was serious, convinced the bishop that he was serious, and the guy gave him permission. And so that was what led. So on the day of February 25th, 11 days after they met, at the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, a 600-year-old church across the street from the Artist Cafe, they were married. Billy was the best man. He was the translator, and Billy just said, just say the word for yes in Polish is tak, T-A-K, tak. And Billy said, just say, every time they come to a question, just say tak. Just say tak. But the first thing Pop did is he patted Mom on the side before they walked down the aisle, and Mom grabbed his hand, but Pop wasn't doing it for him. She was strapped. She was wearing her holster and her pistol. Pop said, take that off. I don't look good. But the night before, this is it. This is the night before they were married. The night before the wedding, the weather deteriorated once again. In her small hotel room, BISIA sat on the bed. The lamp beside the bedside table cast a shallow amber light. Feelings came in waves, like the wind-whipped snow swirling around the city. She never expected to live through the upheaval of the last 6 years. No one ever schooled her for the pressure of so many killings and bombings. Bone-tired, her life had been a pressure cooker, the danger unrelenting. This is her. Yes, it is all very noble to fight for your country, but you would also like to live a normal life, whatever that was. I sat on the edge of the bed with my head in my hands, confusion, depression, and loneliness setting in. I didn't know what to do. What am I getting into, I wondered. I made the commitment. I said I will do it. What will happen? How will I handle it? Her thoughts raced, but only with questions, never any answers. It might have been easier to cling to the remnants of a dream than to face the harsh reality that may lay ahead. But after 6 years of living on the knife's edge, afraid to say or do anything that's wrong, but not knowing what the right thing is, with no ability to plan, only to react, she felt emotionally spent. BISIA saw her pistol nesting in its holster, hanging like a provocation on the back of the lone chair in the room. The wind rattled the window. After so long, she simply wanted to be, nothing more. Would it be right to marry a stranger? Her instincts were all that remained, and her instincts said, yes, go forward. Stop thinking, she said, and worrying. I told myself, nothing is certain. Only you can create a future for yourself. And then she was settled. And the next day they were married. And then it began. They were together for 10 days after that, and they laughed. She felt settled. Here was somebody who was strong, who seemed to really care for her, and she could lean on, and she was settled. But then he was rounded up by an American colonel with all the other strays in the area. And he had to go, he was being put on a train to go to Odessa. He couldn't take her with him. This was their reception. Afterwards at the Hotel Europa. And Mom and I in 1987 were at the Hotel Europa, and I'm interviewing her, and the waiter said, "What are you doing?" And we explained, and he gave us the table set. He gave us the vase and the napkin holder, and Pop used the napkin holder for holding his bills for years after that. So that was sweet. But before he left his handwritten note to any American authority, "Please help, just please help." And Pop said when he left at the train station in Lublin, "Mom, just go west, find Americans. Find Americans." And Mom said, without ever saying anything, it was always Nuremberg. That was the place to go. That's where Patton's Third Army had been set up. And so that's where she tried to go. It took 9 months to escape from Soviet-occupied Poland. Very much like Casablanca. There were no exit visas. You couldn't leave. The borders were all sealed. But she finally was walking through the town square in Krakow one day, and she saw her nephew, or cousin, Henry. And Henry says, "Oh, BISIA, what are you doing?" He says, "Well, I hear you married an American." "Yes." "Well, I'm trying to leave." He says, "When do you leave?" He says, "Oh, tomorrow," the next day. He says, "Okay, I'm with you," because he wanted to go to South America, where he had also relatives. He says, "I know someone at the train yard." So the night she said goodbye to her parents. Maybe that's something, goodbye to Papa. This is a good one. The night before, the last time she'd ever see her parents. Lisia, L-I-S-I. Lisia was the special name, meaning baby, that her father had called BISIA as a young child. She was the youngest of her oldest brother was 17 years older than she was. Her sister was 3 years. 17, 15, 10, 5, and 3. Mom was by far. Her parents were 48 and 40 when she was born in 1921. That's old to be a parent nowadays. Imagine what it was in 1921. So she was almost treated like the next generation, not taken seriously. So she was always fighting to get respect. So Lisia was the name meaning baby that his father called BISIA as a young child. Father and daughter had shared precious little for many years. Age alone created that distance. Only in the last years of service did the two form a bond of sorts. He had also fought for the homeland during the Polish-Russian War in 1920 and then World War I. He says, "I don't even have five zlotys. I have no money to give you because we had nothing." He took her hands. It was all very hard because I was aware this was the last time I'd ever see my father. Yet I didn't want to cry. I wanted us to part as fellow soldiers because that was our bond. Yet inside I felt total emptiness. With his thumb, he made the sign of the cross on her forehead. Then he took her face and cradled it in his hands and kissed both her cheeks with a tenderness that would have to last a lifetime. "Let us know if you make it." And that was it. The next morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, off she went to the train station with Henry. The guy they knew was on top of a boxcar. Russians were walking along, checking the inside, but they weren't checking on top. The train took off 140 kilometers to go to Chechen, the town on the Czech border. Top of a boxcar right into the Czech border. Then they had to sneak across the Czech border where they had some connection, supposedly in this town, but they went up to check the connection. They weren't at home, scared to death. They made their way to Prague. Finally, she made her way to Nuremberg, where she showed the Americans the note, and they helped. By that time, they got in contact with Pop. They said, "We've got her, protect her." And then finally I guess it was, she met her brother Stash, who was fighting for the British Army. And that was the first time they had met in like 6 or 7 years. And then they exchanged war stories. But he had fought for the British Army, and he referred to them as, Bob drove her crazy. He said, "Well, you were bandits. He said, they're shooting at us every bit as much as them shooting at you. You have the Geneva Convention to protect you. We didn't have that." So there was this, again, her brother, he was always challenging her throughout the whole life, and Harry was challenging her again. But it didn't last, and they parted as friends. And then she got her passport. And on December 4th, she boarded the Belgian Unity, a Liberty ship that was built in the South Portland shipyard. And those pictures I took in August, because I do a road race. I broadcast a road race in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, every August, which is a suburb of Portland. And we went over to the South Portland shipyard, and we saw the little plaque where the Belgian Unity was built in 1942. And it took Mom like 50, they were lost at sea, big storm. 2 of the boats they were with turned back. hers lost at sea, almost capsized any number of times. And she said, how ironic. I go through all this crap for all these years, and I'm gonna die on some boat on the Atlantic Ocean, but it didn't. And she landed in Boston on, I think, January 4th, 1946. And my Uncle Burton, who lived in New York City, picked her up, took her to New York, where she kind of got herself together for a couple of days, and then she ended up coming to the United States and landing at Union Station. And then there's the picture of Mom about to eat her young. In 1950. And then there's Pop, I call that the joy of fatherhood. I said, we did not grow up in a child-centric universe, but I did. Whatever I did, I did. It was not the last picture anyway. But the bottom line, there was one of Mark. I wanted to show the one of Mark. I mean, he deserves to be in a hunt, right? 1954. Look at him, again, look, standing up straight. Mark wanted to go to West Point for years and years because Pop stayed in the Army and the reserves, and retired as a lieutenant colonel. But that was us in St. Anne in 1954. And then from 1958 to 2008, we lived at 4122 Flora Place, across the street from Frank Cusimano and Bob Bruner, and Danny Slay was up the block, and Steve Davis down the block, and we had the League of Friends, and we were there the other day reminiscing. And Mark and Tress and I sat on the stoop of the house 2 days ago and did the same thing, just reminiscing about our lives on Flora Place and going to Barrow Hall and City House and St. Lucie High, etc. And there's the Lesko Castle today. And for those at least 30 years, the family's been trying to get it back, but it's impossible. It's those estates were like old ranches in the United States West. It required easy credit and cheap labor. And it was all like, they weren't cash rich, they were land rich. It was like a 15,000 acre estate, but if you got the castle back, it'd just be a money pit. There was nothing to do with it. It doesn't have the emotional connection with Tressa, Mark, and I that it does with the Krasicki family back in Poland. But that's what that looks like today. And then there's Mom and Pop at Maria's wedding in 1999, Maria and Dan's wedding. And then that's the last picture of the Christmas in 2008. And they always, I mean, sure, I mean, they were damaged people. You have a story like that, and you go to war like that, and there's so much that changes. How could they not be damaged, right? So they, as I said, they lived happily and not. There were a lot of bad times, but they were devoted to one another. There was something about how they lived and how they come together that only they shared. Mom always said, there's no one I could go to ever say, do you remember? You're on an island and the island is you. Pop was the only one that she could really share that with. Until their last days together, I mean, there's devotion. There really was. Then now, Mom died in April of 2009. Pop died 13 months later. And they're both buried in Jefferson Barracks. And I just visited the other day with my friend Johnny Jameson, who came, bless your heart, from Los Angeles. He's a running friend of mine from LA, and both of Johnny's parents, and Marvine, his sister, and Mary, his cousin. But Marvine and Johnny's parents are both buried there, and we went together to visit our parents. And so that's essentially the story. It's a wonderful story. I always said I was just proximate to it. Tressa, Mark, and I, we didn't know BISIA and ISHAM. We knew Mom and Pop. They were different people, like all of our parents. They're the sun and the moon of our lives. But we looked to them for everything. But we didn't know them as individuals and what led them to these adventures, or why Pop decided at age 33. I mean, some soldiers came back with a German Luger. Pop came back with a Polish Countess. And Mom took a flyer, just an absolute flyer on this man. And it's like, you talk about the randomness of any of us being alive, but just consider Tressa, Mark, and I, the chances of us being around with a story like that. Two people that knew each other for 11 days and got married without even speaking the same language. That's my story, that's their story. I can't thank you guys enough for being here. I've held you hostage here for this last period of time. I'm more than happy to be your prisoner for any questions you may have.
If we have any Q&A, thank you so much.